This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good evening, Rabbi. So we're still in the heat of the summer, and some people told me they don't want to hear yet about Elul. You know, they're not ready to do tshuva yet. So we're going to take it easy on you and give a little bit of a different type of topic. Speak about a very interesting historical episode, a figure in history which is not so well known, and we're going to talk about some Yesodei Ha'emunah, which is kedai to clarify. Actually, the point of contention that we're going to discuss tonight is a very delicate one, and it's a point of contention that has arisen throughout history, and it's kedai to really pinpoint the issue that we're dealing with. Okay, so let's begin. We're speaking tonight about Rav Dovid Nieto. Who's Rav Dovid Nieto? Rav Dovid Nieto was the Av Bezdin of London. He lived from Tuf Yodalid to Tuf Peches, 1654 to 1728. He was born in Venice in 1654. He was a Dayan, he was a Darshan, he was an Av Bezdin, he was also a Rosh Hashiva. He received smicha in Livorno, and then he became the Av Bezdin of the Sephardic community in London. So it's interesting, Bechlal, you know, the Achronim generally lived in Europe, they lived in Poland, in Germany, in Russia. You don't typically think of Achronim who lived in London, and the truth is there were not so many, and one of the main reasons is because the Jews were expelled from England in the year 1290 on Tisha B'Av. So there were no Jews really there from 1290 and on, and then slowly the Jewish community developed, I believe, in the 17th century. So this Rav Dovid Nieto, and I'm really saving the best for last, because I have a picture that I'm going to give out of Rav Dovid Nieto, and it's pretty interesting. So he was a great Gadol b'Torah. This is coming from the Sefer Melitzei Eish. Melitzei Eish was written by Rav Avram Stern. Rav Avram Stern was the father of the Debretziner Rav, and he wrote a Sefer called Melitzei Eish, where basically, you know, nowadays they have a Sefer called Zechronim Levracha, where they gives you the yahrzeit of whose yahrzeit is on every single day of the Jewish calendar. Not every yahrzeit is given. For example, Rabbi Avram Stern has yahrzeits that are not on the modern Sfarim. The modern Sfarim, they have all the Rebbes, they have all the contemporary. Sometimes they could forget about old Achronim that are not so well known. And one of these Achronim that are not mentioned in the contemporary yahrzeit Sfarim, but it is mentioned by the Debretziner Rav's father, Rav Avram Stern. The date is Chaf Ches Teves. Chaf Ches Teves was the Petira of Rav Dovid Nieto, the Av Bezdin of London. He was a great kanoi against the Shabtai Tzvi. Let's explain now, you know, just historically, how many Achronim really made it to London? Well, after 1290, the Jews were expelled. In the times of Oliver Cromwell, Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas, together with Menashe ben Israel. One time we spoke about Menashe ben Israel last Shavuos when we talked about the Aseres Hashvatim. So we spoke about Menashe ben Israel. So Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas and Menashe ben Israel, the two of them together came and they petitioned Oliver Cromwell, and Oliver Cromwell really acceded to them, and he did eventually allow the Jewish return to England. So you had Menashe ben Israel, you had Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas. Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas was from Morocco, but he was then in Amsterdam, one of the great old-time Go'enim, Mikubalim, and probably the greatest antagonist to the Shabtai Tzvi. And then we have Rav Dovid Nieto. We're going to see Rav Dovid Nieto was a great antagonist specifically to Nehemiah Chiyun. After the death of Shabtai Tzvi, there were still closet Sabbatians everywhere. There were still lots of people who believed that Shabtai Tzvi was the Mashiach, was the Messiah, even though he's dead. Even though he converted to Islam and he's dead, there were many followers of the Shabtai Tzvi because of the efforts of Nehemiah Chiyun. And Rav Dovid Nieto basically wrote a sefer called Eish Das, where he obliterates the works of Nehemiah Chiyun. So these are some of the activities of Rav Dovid Nieto. He wrote a sefer that Emertz Hashem we're going to discuss by Shal Shudas this week. The name of the sefer is The Kuzari Hasheni. Everybody knows the Kuzari, right? The Kuzari of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the Kuzari proves the divinity of the Torah Shebachsav. Rav Dovid Nieto writes that the Kuzari does not really discuss the divine origin of the Tarsha Bal Peh. And therefore he wrote a second Kuzari, which he calls Kuzari Sheni, which he feels that if you learn Kuzari Rishon together with the Kuzari Sheni, then the whole Torah, Tarsha B'Chsav and Tarsha Bal Peh, will stand very firmly on these two foundations. Well, be it as it may, it's very interesting. We're going to discuss Mirz Hashem on Shabbos some of the incredible proofs that the name of the Kuzari Sheni is called Matei Dan, and I'm going to show you a picture of Rav Dovid Nieto writing the Kuzari Sheni, the Matei Dan. He proves, for example, that Hashem punishes Cain for killing Hevel. Why did Hashem punish Cain for killing Hevel? Hashem never warned Cain not to kill Hevel. You can't punish somebody if they're not warned. Elamai, he says, that's a raya. There was Tarsha Bal Peh, not only Misinai, already from the first day of the creation of man, there already existed Tarsha Bal Peh. Hashem told Bal Peh, Cain and Hevel, Lo Sirtzach. And he brings rayas that there's Tarsha Bal Peh to Noach and to Avraham, and that all the drashas of Chazal, it's not that the Rabbanim are inventing it. No, they had a strong tradition that the dinim are true, and all the drashas, he says, are asmachta to the Torah that they already had a Messiah of. Okay, we'll discuss that in Mirz Hashem on Shabbos. Okay, so Rav Dovid Nieto was niftar on Chav Ches Teves on the day that he turned 74 years old. So we mentioned he comes from Venice, and his father, it's interesting, one of the great Rabbanim in Italy at the time was Rav Dovid, Rav Shmuel Abuhav. The Shaus HaTshuvas Devar Shmuel. And in the Shaus HaTshuvas Devar Shmuel, we find two different references to his father, the father of Dovid Nieto. His name was Rav Pinchas Nieto in Siman Kuf Pei and in Siman Kuf Tzadi Beis. So let's talk a little bit about Rav Dovid Nieto. Very interesting. In the times of the early Achronim, many of the early Achronim were not only great Gedolim in Torah, they were also doctors. And not only practicing medicine, but they're also philosophers of medicine, meaning they taught medicine. The problem was that there were no universities available at the time that allowed entry of Jews. There was one university in Europe that allowed Jews to enter and learn in that university medicine, and that was the University of Padua. So there were many Gedolim who studied in the University of Padua. In fact, one of the Kadmoinim, Rabbi Yehuda Mintz was niftar in 1508. Rabbi Yehuda Mintz not only studied medicine in the University of Padua, he studied philosophy in the University of Padua, and he was one of the professors of philosophy in the University of Padua. Rabbi Yehuda Mintz, the Mari Mintz. In fact, there's a great Gadol who comes from Padua who says that Kemat, not only were all the Jews his students, all the Christians were his students in the University of Padua. So the Ramchal had a Talmud. Ramchal, one of the great Talmud of the Ramchal, was somebody by the name of Rabbi Kusiel Gordon. Rabbi Kusiel Gordon came from Vilna. What's he doing in Italy? He went to Padua, to the University of Padua, to study medicine. So he's learning from the Ramchal. Finally he says, Ramchal, I'm learning so much from you, I think I want to drop out from the university, forget the medicine. So the Ramchal said, let me ask the Malach. So Ramchal asked the Maggid, and the Maggid told the Ramchal, no, he should stay and continue. He should continue in the medical school. It's brought down in the Igros of the Ramchal. Anyway, Rav Dovid Nieto not only is a great Gadol b'Torah, not only did he have smicha, he was also studied medicine in the University of Padua. He got his doctorate in 1679. Okay, and he lives in various cities, Livorno, Reggio, Rome. And in Livorno, Rav Dovid Nieto is the Dayan, is the Darshan, is the Rosh Hashiva, he's the doctor. I mean, you talk about being busy. There's, rabbis are busy, doctors are busy, and the combination of the two, does not spell for much leisure time. Fine. Now, one day, Rav Dovid Nieto, I guess at a certain point, he's offered a job in London. Now, London is a far away from being a Rav in Livorno. And Rav Dovid Nieto is an acclaimed doctor, acclaimed philosopher, acclaimed Rav, Posek, and speaker. And they have negotiations. And what's very interesting is, for some reason, it was always a topic of fascination, as it is today. How much money does the rabbi make? That is everybody's favorite sub. Right? Everybody loves to discuss. How much money does the rabbi make? Does he deserve more? Does he deserve less? Why does he get so much? What does he need it for? What's he using it for? Right? That's always a topic of fascination. And you see, in the times of the early Achronim, it was recorded that everybody knew how much money was offered to Rav Dovid Nieto, and here it's recorded for posterity. They offered him 100 layish lishana. Layish is Rashi Tevois, litrim sterling, 100 litrim sterling, which is a tremendous amount. Let's call it $100,000 a year. You know, it's a lot of money. And besides that, it's amazing. They gave him another $10,000 on Purim. It's a lot of money. Then they paid $60,000 for his moving expenses. It's a lot of money. Plus his mortgage, his rent, he lived free. So he was doing well. Big salary, bonuses on the Yom Tovim, free rent and board. And he comes to London in 1701, Erev Rosh Hashanah, at the time that they were building a brand new shul. And he's inaugurated as the new Rav. Okay. So what's very interesting is when he was in Livorno, he was the Doiresh. Now there was a difference. There were two different positions. There was a Dayan and there was a Doiresh. In Europe, the Rav's job was not to be a speaker. You see, nowadays they think if you're a good speaker, you must be a Talmid Chacham. No, just because the guy's a good speaker, he could be an Amoritz Gomor. Well, what does one thing got to do with the other? And very often you have big Talmid Chachamim. They get up to the podium and you don't understand the word they say because they can't speak well. It's really two different talents. Now, if you're smart enough and you hear a guy speak, you could tell whether, Epis can learn it or not, whether the guy can learn or not. But it used to be division of parts. You had the Av Bezdin, and he was the Paisik, and everyone came to him for Shabbos. He gave a Shabbos Hagala Drasha, Shabbos Shuva Drasha. He did not speak every Shabbos. There's no such thing that a Rav spoke every Shabbos. In fact, the joke goes that in Europe, the Rav got an Aliyah every Shabbos and spoke twice a year. And in America, the Rav speaks every Shabbos and gets an Aliyah twice a year. That's how times have changed. But it used to be, you look in the drashas, Chacham Sofer and Rabbi Yonasan, they gave drashas at very specific times of the year. Fine. Rav Dovid Nieto, primarily in Italy, was a doiresh, but when he came to London and he's hired as the Av Bezdin, he felt that one of the primary jobs of the Rav is to speak publicly. Because yes, people have shilas. First of all, does everyone ask shilas? Not everybody asks shilas. And even if you ask a shilah, do you listen to what the Rav? Not everybody listens. And even if you do you understand? Are you makabel? And so on and so forth. But speaking, it's something that you could do on a regular basis. It's the best way to impart aliyah and information to the shul. Okay. Be it as it may, he was hired to speak once every 2 weeks, and he comes to London and he speaks twice a Shabbos, which is considered a tremendous amount. But then what happened was, on one particular Shabbos, on Chav Gimel Kislev, in the year Taf Samach Vav. So what year is Taf Samach Vav? We'll make it a little warmer. I think people are very cold over here. Yeah, Taf Samach Vav. That is the year 1706. And he got up to give a drasha. And if anybody knows anything about Rabbanis, there's always going to be a drasha, once a year, once every 2 years. There's always going to be something that happens in a shul that people get all, they get crazy about it. That's part of the job. Every rabbi knows that comes with the territory. Something's going to happen every so often that people are going to get riled up about. And he got up to speak one particular Shabbos with great hislavos. And first let me read you the account of Rabbi Yaakov Emden himself. We know that Rabbi Yaakov Emden wrote one of the most controversial svarim in history, and certainly the most controversial autobiography. Rabbi Yaakov Emden wrote an autobiography called the Megillah Sefer. And it's well known, Rabbi Yaakov Emden was very fond of his father, the Chacham Tzvi, Rabbi Tzvi Ashkenazi. And Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes that one time his father traveled to London because the people there, they wanted to get a glimpse at this tzaddik, at this gadol. And what happened? There was a rabbi there named Rabbi Nieto. And he gave a drasha, and it shook up the city, and it shook up the country, and it really reverberated around the world. What already did this rabbi say? What was so controversial? So Rabbi Yaakov Emden doesn't get into such details. He just says very bekitzer that Rabbi Nieto got up, and he said that Teva is Hashem Yisbarach. And people went crazy. Wait, Teva is Hashem Yisbarach? How could you say such a thing? It's apikarsos, it's minos, the shul supported him. There were people who were against it. Some people said it's apikarsos, some people said he was a koifar. Now again, he was a big tzaddik. He's the one who wrote Kuzari Hasheni. But as you'll see, he was a very broad-minded individual, as you'll see from the picture that we have. And it created a tremendous amount of controversy to the point where there's a guy by the name of Yeshua Tzarfasi. Yeshua Tzarfasi said that he would not step into the same room as Rabbi Dovid Nieto because he said Rabbi Dovid Nieto is an apikoros and a koifar. And if you don't believe me, let's take it to any bezdin anywhere in the world. How could this rabbi say that Teva is Ribono Shel Olam? So the board got together and they kicked this Yeshua Tzarfasi out of the shul. Now, it's amazing. The more things change, the more they stay the same. This guy, Yeshua Tzarfasi, had just pledged a lot of money to the new building. Somehow, it's always the guys who pledge money to the new building that they get themselves in trouble and now they're not part of the shul anymore. It's like conveniently, that's what always happens throughout history. It's the people who pledge the money to the new shul. He got himself in trouble and they threw him out. Oh, oy vey, he says, Nebuch, what am I going to do? And he created a tremendous controversy. They took it to the Attorney General of the UK. And they didn't know what to do. So Rav Dovid Nieto did not back down. And he wrote a book in Spanish called De la Divina Providencia, etc. That's the name of the book. Etc. is part of that said, no, I said this, and I believe it. And this is Emunah Shlema, that Teva is Hashem Yisbarach. And if you don't believe it, you're not apikoros. So now we have a major machlokes here. Some say that what he said was minos, and he says that if you don't believe in what he's saying, it's minos. So now we have to define, is there something called Teva? What is Teva? Is that nature? Mother Nature, right? You hear that word? Mother Nature made an eclipse, and Mother Nature this, and Mother Nature that. Is there an entity called nature? Well, let's clarify. Obviously, we don't believe there are any beings that have control. But let's clarify. Is there something that God made a system, meaning God sort of, wound up the world, cranked it up, he put in enough cranks that it should go 6,000 years, and then basically the sun goes like that, and the earth is going like that, right? The earth's going, it's rotating, it's revolving, it's wobbling, it's the whole galaxies are moving, and God set everything into motion. He set into motion that if you get a boo-boo on your finger, all the platelets gather and they close it up, and God is relaxing up in Shemayim because everything is set into motion. Meaning, do we believe there's God, and then there's Teva, and then there's an Olam, or do we not believe that? So what's the alternative? Or do we believe that the Ribono Shel Olam is actively, currently, specifically imposing His will on the phenomenon, and Hashem is imposing His will sunrise, sunset. Hashem is actively imposing His will on the lave, beat, actively imposing His will on gravity. Not that Hashem created gravity, and now every time you throw this up, it automatically falls down. No, God every second is actively imposing His will and ordering the forces of nature. That's the Shaila. And Rav Dovid Nieto said that there is no such thing as nature. There's no such thing as gravity, which God set into motion. No. The phenomenon of nature are specifically imposed by God every moment. That's the way I understand what he was trying to say. And this became a big machlokes. Why? Because they accused him of something called Pantheism. What is Pantheism? Pantheism was the invention of this guy, Baruch Spinoza, who was of Spinoza, philosopher of Spanish-Portuguese descent from Marranos, and he the philosophy of Spinozaism, or Pantheism. And by the way, the Vilna Gaon had a taina on a certain movement that this was also guilty of it. We won't get into that right now. That the concept is that all of reality, everything you see, is a reflection and embodiment of God. And that was one of the major machlokes in between the Gra and the early Hasidim. The Gra said, what do you mean God is everywhere? God's not everywhere. God, He's not in the Beis HaKisei. He's not in a Makam Tameh. He created it, but that's not a reflection of Him. And others said, no. Baruch Kavod Hashem Mimakaimai. Or do we say, Malay Chal Haaretz Kavoidai? Some say it's a machlokes Malachi Asharis, the Oifanim and the Srafim. This was the central machlokes between the Gra and the early Hasidim. But we're not getting into that right now. The concept of pantheism, which we utterly reject, is that we do not believe that all of reality is a embodiment of the divine, if we could explain such a thing, but rather we'll explain what we do believe. The famous pantheists were this guy Spinoza, who was put into Cherem 50 years before rabdavani yato. Beethoven was a famous pantheist. Albert Einstein. But we reject that. What do we say? We're going to see. And rabdavani yato got up in a drasha in London, and he defended it in his work, Della Divina Providencia, that God and nature are the same. Now that sounds very close to pantheism. Because what do you mean nature is God? We believe that God is the boire, but nature is not. In other words, pantheism is that the physicality is a reflection of Hashem. So they felt he was getting very close to Spinoza. And that's why this guy, Yehoshua Tzarfasi, would not go into the same room with him. And the machlokes erupted. Who are they going to take the shaila to? So Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes, they took it to Dad. They took it to my father, the Chacham Tzvi. And amazingly, now the Chacham Tzvi was not the kind of guy, there are different kinds of rabbanim. Some rabbanim, it's wonderful, it's great, it's terrific, it's amazing, right? Everything is great. And some rabbanim, no, everything is bad, everything is wrong. They say, there was a great kanoi, Rav Hillel Kalamaya. Somebody who down is in the shul is a descendant of him. He gave me some of his svarim. He was one of the big kanoim. So you come into a city, this is wrong, the mezuzah is out of place, and the mechitza is like this, and the tefillah is like that. Everything was And they said, well, what do you want from our life? The Sanzer Rav was here last Shabbos, and he said everything is gewaldik, everything was mamish, kiddush Hashem. So Hillel Kalamai said like this, there were two midwives. They were Shifra and Pua. Shifra means she's mashaper. Everything's good, everything's sweet, everything. Pua is poo, 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 he said. They're different mahalchim, you need both. And, okay. But be it as it may, Reb Chacham Tzvi was a tremendous kanoi. Rabbi Yaakov Emden said he's a kanoi ben kanoi. They're referring to himself. Rabbi Yaakov Emden himself was a kanoi ben kanoi. And if Chacham Tzvi smelled something that's fishy, he wouldn't say, oh, okay, it's good, good kazak. No, he would let you know. And he was posed with this question. He got a transcript of the Drasha rabdavani Nieto. And incredibly, in the Shas Chuvas Chacham Tzvi Siman Yerches, not only does he defend rabdavani Nieto, he says Yasher Koyach for clarifying the Emunah Pshuta of Klal Yisrael and not allowing the Jewish people to steer off Yamin or Small from the correct Emunah B'Hashem. Now, by the way, the community in London was so happy with the psak of the Chacham Tzvi, they said, we're going to offer you the position of Av Bezin of London. And they offered him, guess how much money? 500 litra sterling. That's 5 times what rabdavani yato was making, plus an additional guaranteed 500 litra sterling. Basically, they're going to pay him $1 million a year to become the Av Bezin of London. 10 times what rabdavani yato was making. Rav Yaakov Emden records this. It's like, what they have in sports. You have salary, guaranteed, what is it called? The bonus. No, not bonus. Yeah, no, not incentives. You have some of the salary is like guaranteed. Even if the player gets injured, what is it called? Guaranteed, yeah. Okay, whatever. No, you guys don't know anything. Okay, so So there's part of the salary. So they were going to offer the Chacham Tzvi $500 a year, basically $500,000 a year if he performs, $500,000 guaranteed, plus free rent and board. And Rav Chacham Tzvi turned it down. So he said, he turned it down because this is what happened. They offered him money for deciding on the case of Dovid Nieto, so he didn't want to take it. So he said, here's a rabbi who doesn't like money, so they offered him even more. I guess they figured he wouldn't take it. He said, wait a second. Ashkenazi anoichi. I'm an Ashkenazi. And I don't want to move to London and my children are going to become Sfardim, my grandchildren become Sfardim. And what's going to happen? We're going to lose the Messiah of Ashkenazis. He says, I want my children to remain in the Messiah of my grandfather, my father. I don't care about the money. And says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, this is not the only big offer he had. He had offers in Livorno to be also tremendous salary. And instead he stayed in Germany, in Hamburg. He was making, I'll tell you how much he was making. Shishim Reiches Teller Lashana. He was making like $6,000 a year. You know? So instead he could have been making $1 million, half of it guaranteed. He said, no, it's not worth allowing my children to slip into Sfardiness at the expense of, okay. But that's what Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes about the godless of his father, the Chacham Tzvi. So let's learn a little bit from the Shal Shechuvas Chacham Tzvi in Siman Yurches. So they pose the following, is number 7 on the sheet. They pose the following question to the Chacham Tzvi. One of the Askanim in London, in Anglaterra, where the great Gevirim, the Parnasei Manhigei Kahal Kadosh Shari Shamayim. Okay. Here was the Shaila. The great Chacham, third paragraph, Hamaroimam Venala, Rav Dovid Nieto, the Avbezin, the Marat Tzedek in Kahal Kadosh Shari Shamayim. He was Doirish in the Beis HaKnesses, and here's a translation copied from the original Spanish. And Rav Dovid Nieto got up and he said, I already said in the yeshiva that Hashem Yisbarach and the Teva and Hashem Yisbarach, it's all one. And why do I say that? Says Rav Dovid Nieto, it's not my chiddush. It's a chiddush of Dovid HaMelech. Dovid HaMelech says in Tehillim, and we say it every single day, HaMechase Shamayim Ba'avim. God covers the heavens with clouds. Listen carefully. It's not the pshat that there's a phenomenon called condensation. So now the moisture in the atmosphere rises up and forms clouds. No, that is, says Dovid Nieto, if you believe that God just created a phenomenon of science that acts on its own, that's apikarsis. No, we believe that God is the phenomenon, now listen carefully, He is the phenomenon, we're going to clarify this, that causes the heavens to be covered with clouds. He covers the heavens with clouds. He makes it rain. It's not that there's a system of evaporation and condensation and weather formation. No, God is the one who forms the clouds. He's the one who makes it rain. He's the one who makes the wind blow. Says Rav Dovid Nieto, the word nature is a modern word. It was created, he says, about 400 or 500 years ago. So, I mean, he's in 1700. So he says, we don't find the word Teva in the Gemara. Nowhere in the Gemara does it say Teva. Nowhere in the Medrash does it say Teva. All it says is God makes the wind blow, He makes the rain fall, He makes the dew go on the grass. From here, it's mukhrach that there was no such thing as Teva. That which we call hashgacha is what the modern term Teva refers to. And therefore I say Elohim and Teva, by the way, Teva is Gematria, Elohim, it's all one. This is the correct, he says, Deyazu, He Yeshara, Chasida, Ukedosha, and if you don't believe it, you're an apikoyas, you're a karoi. So they came to him and they said, well, this is apikoyas. What do you mean God is Teva? What, God is gravity? God is evaporation? God is condensation? That's very close to pantheism. You're you're saying that the physical reality is divine. So just listen carefully. So Rav Dovid Nieto said, it's well known that clouds and rain are specific details of nature. But the one who covers the heavens with the cloud is not the cloud. Says Rav Dovid Nieto, I'm not saying God is the cloud. I'm saying God is the one who covers the heavens with the clouds. Meaning that what David HaMelech is saying is not that Hashem is the rain, is the cloud, is the items of nature, but He's the force that covers the heavens with clouds. He's the force that makes it rain. The way I understand it is, it's not that God is gravity, but He's the force that makes gravity operate. It's not that God is condensation, but He's the one who fuels condensation. He is not the phenomenon. He actively makes the phenomenon happen. So therefore, what I'm trying to say, says Rav Dovid Nieto, is that the Rebbeinu Shalom is the Teva. There is no Teva. All the phenomenon are fueled by the Rebbeinu Shalom. People like to say, oh, what does Mother Nature have in store for us today? So it's clear out, it's apikarsis, it's heresy. There's no concept of Mother Nature. There is no nature. It's the Rebbeinu Shalom. It's not that, by nature a heart beats a certain amount of times in a lifetime. The Rebbeinu Shalom is actively imposing His will on all the phenomenon. And therefore, says Rav Dovid Nieto, Ani meir einayim barayos ha'amuros shema shehem miyavsim al teva. Whatever mankind attributes to nature, mechuyavim anachnu liyachsei el Hashem yisbarach. We are obligated to attribute to God. Ritzoini shehashgachasai v'hu yisbarach hakol echad. Says Rav Dovid Nieto in conclusion, Umasha amarti shalimud zehu tzak v'yoshem. When I say this is righteous and correct, I substantiate it from Sukkim, that we believe that when you have food on the table, it's not that, if you plant, it's not that if you plant wheat and you grind it and you mix it with water and you bake it, then by nature this is what happens. But at every step of the process, the Rebbeinu Shalom is actively imposing His will and fueling the process. There is no Teva chutz mimenu yisbarach. Comes a Chacham Tzvi. Again, you see why it's close to something which is dangerous. Again, what's dangerous is to say God is the phenomenon, but that's not what he's saying. He's saying God fuels the phenomenon. Comes the Chacham Tzvi. It's a famous tshuva, Siman Yirches. He said, Ani roya es divrei hachacham hamaroimam v'nala shehein divrei hakuzari. What do you want from him? It is not his chiddush. The Kuzari already said it in the Maimar Rishon. And Rabbi Yehuda Muskata, one of the commentators on the Kuzari, writes explicitly, Hu Yisbarach Yikra Teva. We believe Teva is a name for Hashem. Teva is a name for Hashem. Why is Hashem called Teva? Because He makes the image. He's the Matzbiah. He's the one who is Toiveya B'chaisamai, all of the phenomenon. In other words, the gravity is like a coin, and God is the minter of that coin. God minted gravity. He minted condensation. So He's the matbiya. He made the image. He made the form. He is the molder of these phenomenon. And this is what it means. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Yoshev v'zon mikarnei re'imim v'yad beitzei kinim. Listen carefully. We think, I'm telling you, I think most people fall into the trap of what Rav Dovid Nieto is coming up with. We think, there's something called nature. Nature is like this. If I become a doctor, I make this amount of money a year. And if I become a lawyer, I make this amount of money a year. And if I become a plumber, I make this. Once I get, Avad Hashem's going to help me find my job. But once I got my job, I'm on that conveyor belt, which automatically brings in this and this and this. In other words, we believe, we unfortunately have this notion that there's certain conveyor belts in life. Once God helped us with A, then everything else is programmed in that system, and Hashem's, no, there are no conveyor belts, there are no systems. Every hour, every minute of the day, every dollar that comes into our pocket, there are no systems, there are no conveyor belts. Everything is designated, detailed, specific, hashgacha pratis. There's no teva. There is no teva. There are no systems. Doesn't matter what your job is. You could have job A and make $1 million. You could have job B and not make anything. Every moment, Rebbe Hashem sits and feeds the egg of the lice. Well, Hashem's busy doing that. I thought Hashem set into motion all these systems. It's not, Hashem's not a computer programmer that he programmed the world and, things then play out the way he programmed it. Hashem is actively sitting there with a spoon. Every spoon that you eat, every time you put, Hashem is holding that spoon and feeding you that food. Noisein lechem l'chol basar. He is actively giving you food. Says the Chacham Tzvi, I hear the tainos on rabdavani yato. I don't know what they are. Nimtiye apirio nimtiye la chacham adoresh. Give the, in America they say, give the guy a cigar. Give him chazak ve'amatz. It's a beautiful drasha. What's the problem with what he said? What? It's a pchisus that God is specifically involved in every dollar that goes into my pocket and every ounce of every raindrop that falls on my nose. That's Rebbe Hashem putting it there. What's their problem? They don't like to hear that. They feel it's beneath God's dignity that He does every detail, and they'd rather think that God sits there on Shamayim and He sort of set into motion His servants called Teva. No, says Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Listen carefully. He says like this: you should know, Yedu. Those who prefer to think that there's intermediary called Teva that runs the world is apt to fall into many stumbling blocks. Masha'in Kain on the 5th line. If you believe that everything is a specific hashgacha, wherever you turn, you will be secure. Maybe you'll say, I knew this already, I believe this already, but I think that on some level, we somehow think that there's like these Hashem set into motion certain things. Like, of course, He did everything, but like, I'm already in that program, No, there's no programs. And if you think, says Rav Chacham Tzvi, maybe what they thought he meant was that God, I understand, is not the table, and He's not the sun, but maybe what they thought he meant was He is the phenomenon. He is the forces of nature. That is Him. Says the Chacham Tzvi, nobody in their right mind would say such a thing. Nobody would say God is gravity, God is condensation. Certainly and obviously what he meant is He fuels these phenomena. He creates, He powers these phenomena. Nobody in the right, no apikoros would say such a thing, let alone a tzaddik and a kadosh like Rav Dovid Nieto. And, Rabbi Isai, says the Chacham Tzvi, if you have a problem calling Hashem Teva, this is not rabdavani Yato's invention. The Shlah HaKadosh, who is muchzak be'tzidkos u'v'chasidos in his Sefer Shnei Luchos HaBris, that's been neskabel b'yava b'chol Yisrael, he writes explicitly that schar for oisei mitzvos and the oynesh for oiver averos is Teva. So we had a show recently. Is there schar b'hayama? I thought leka, but there is a concept that it's not schar. The Ramban in the beginning of B'chukoisai, it's a longer discussion. But this type of terminology, that the Rebbe Hashem is the Teva, is not the invention of the rabdavani yato. This is in the Shlah HaKadosh, and in all the Sifrei Kabbalah, the synonymous to the Hashgacha Pratis is the word Teva. So the way we use Teva, we like to think, Rebbe Hashem created the world, but then there's nature. No, there's no such thing. I mean, by the way, just add, if you look at the Ramban at the end of Parshas Bo, the most famous Ramban al Torah, the Ramban says, you have to believe, Ki ein Teva klal. There is no such thing as nature. Now, it looks like there's nature. Certainly it looks like there's nature. I mean, you're telling me every time I do that, Hashem is saying, yeah. No, didn't Hashem just set up a system where that happens? No. There's no Teva. It just looks like it because it's predictable and it happens, it seems like it happens the same way every time. That's the way it seems. But we believe that Rebbe Hashem actively fuels the phenomenon of nature. When we use the word Teva, Teva means the chayfetz and the ratzain of Hamelach HaKadosh of the Ribbon Shalom. Therefore, concludes the Chacham Tzvi, we need to be machzik Teva to this great Chacham, rabdavani Nieto, for this Drasha, that he ensured that Klal Yisrael don't turn their heart away and stray after philosophy, because doing so brings great takala. Says the Chacham Tzvi, before I issue a final verdict, I want to just pass this with two other Chachamim on my Bezdin, which I did, and we all unanimously declare and uphold the psak of my psak, that rabdavani yato should be congratulated and should be strengthened and should be supported for delivering this drasha. And if you don't believe in this emuna, in this tenet, that is apikarsus. In other words, the Chacham Tzvi is defending rabdavani yato, that there is no such thing as Teva. Teva is the Ribbon Shalom himself. I said what I'm going to say for tonight. I overly simplified it. But the Gaon is in the beginning of Sefer Yeshaya. In other words, I already said what I'm going to say about it. Okay. One more thing that rabdavani Nieto was expert in was in astrology. Now, at this point, I'm going to give you a very interesting handout. You could pass this out. Yeah. This is a picture of rabdavani Nieto writing the Sefer Pantheism in London. Yeah? So you have over here, there's a picture of the Sefer Pantheism, but in the background, you'll take a look. In the background, you have his globe. So, well, where isn't his payas, So, but Bekitzer, the rabdavani Nieto, by the way, the Chida also brings him down as one of the historic and well-known Gedolei Yisrael in his official list of Mareches Gedam. He's mentioned in the Chida. So he's defended by the Chacham Tzvi, he's defended by the Chida of one of the great all-time tzaddikim, but he was a very big expert in astronomy. So he wrote a sefer in Italian called Pascalogia, proving that the Christian calendar is very faulty, and he demonstrated based on the fact that their Easter was at that time a month off of Passover, and he was sort of debunking the concept of having just either a lunar or a solar calendar. And what's very interesting, and maybe the most relevant of tonight's shir, is rabdavani Nieto was one of the first people who made a modern luach. Nowadays you go to every Sfarim store, by the checkout counter you can get a luach, both Magen Avrams, the Plaga Mincha, the Yes Plaga Mincha, the two plagues, for every city in the United States of America. One of the first people to make such a luach was rabdavani Nieto, and he wrote something called Bino La'itim, which was published in 1717. Now here's the thing. London is a much higher latitude than Eretz Yisrael. Nobody had ever made Zmanim to make the Zmanim in London in sync with their latitude. Because they end Shabbos much later. So he was the first to establish for all time the Zmanim for London based on the northern latitude that they had. So he did that in 1717. He made a calendar then for 83 years. And in that calendar, he writes to the minute all the solar eclipses that would take place in London. So he's one of the first to, not just to record what solar eclipses that took place, but to record when all the solar eclipses would take place for the next 83 years until the year 1800. Yeah, but he predicted it very precisely. His son, Rabbi Yitzchak Nieto, put out another calendar for 22 years and then for another 13 years, and it was somewhat of a family tradition to the point that he had a descendant in New York in 1902 who also put out a calendar in the same vein as the Zayda, rabdavani Nieto. We mentioned before, and you have it on your sheet, that he also wrote a book called Eish Das, and actually what you have on the sheet, I got it from two sources. The cover sheet they didn't have an Otzar Chachma, they had it on Hebrew books. This is the cover sheet of Eish Das, which is a very powerful work against Nehemiah Chiyun. Nehemiah Chiyun was one of the disseminators of the concept of the Shabtai Tzvi after Shabtai Tzvi's death, and that's from Hebrew books. In the Otzar Chachma, they had their edition of the Eish Das is a conversation between two people, Naphtali and Dan. So rabdavani yato always referred to himself as Dan, because Dan is rabdavani yato. And it's a conversation sort of disproving the Shabtai Tzvi and proving the value of Kabbalah. It's interesting, this edition, apparently they couldn't get an edition. It has somebody's, hagois on it, somebody's handwritten notes. Rabdavani yato was nifter in 1728 on Chavches Teves, exactly 74 years to the date that he was born, and in the old cemetery in London, in Queen Mary University. They still have his kever today, and we have the nusach on his kever. It says, Kvuras HaChacham, HaShalem, HaYashish, HaNichbad, HaChasid, HaAnav, HaDayan, HaMetsuyan, HaRoife, Dovid Nieto, Nisbakesh B'Yeshiva Shamala, B'Yoim Meloislai, Ayin Dalid Shana. So he was a great defender, first of all, of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and he proved how every word of Torah Sheba'al Peh is not the consensus of rabbis. Nothing is invented. Everything is nimsar misinai. He fought valiantly against the Shabtai Tzvi. He established the Zmanim Kahalacha, and he was able to do so because of his background and his very broad education. And he was one of the great defenders of the Torah. Zechusoi Yagen Aleinu V'Akol Yisrael. Amen.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.